the development of the city and miss some opportunities. We go back and forth. And here in San Ramon, we fight that fight every couple of years. When you recognize that it's not just about the change, it's, do you have the political mandate to make the change? You begin to realize that nobody's really working on that except during elections. One of the things that I recall as a planning director, to use an example, we were at the time in the city I worked in working on a very large commercial project that at that time the manufacturers group in Santa Clara County, I forget what their title really was, but and another group were advocating for privately to city council members, to planning commissioners. And finally I gave their director a call and I said, you know, are you aware that decisions are typically made at 10 o'clock at night? It might be raining out, and the only people in the audience are the people who are unhappy about what we are doing. Where are you? Do you really think that the study that you did, that you circulated among all of the people that you associate with, who also never show up at meetings, doesn't get read? And so the decision gets made sometimes based on the squeaky wheel. So I think Don is right in a lot of what he's saying, but one of the things that always frustrated me was you have to start with the premise that most people in suburban communities are there because that's what they like. They don't want this urbanized change. And when you put it in a discrete portion of the city, as we are doing here in San Ramon, we just approved 4,500 units to be built over 27 years. It's in the central business area, away from every neighborhood. And while the election is in November, it's already shaping up. Sides are being drawn. We're changing the character of the city. I moved here because I didn't want to live in an urban area. And so I think at least a part of the discussion we need to have is, why is it in people's interest to change the way Don is talking about? Why do they have as much of a stake in the decision, even though they don't intend to move or leave the house they're in? Why is their future, their livelihood, their well-being linked to us doing this? If they can't see the connection between their employment and what we are doing, the need for housing to sustain that employment, the need for the changes in the city that allow for growth, we're just going to keep going back and forth, every several years with this group of people sitting on the city council until they get diselected, and another group of people sitting there. All of what Don says makes a great deal of sense when you spent the time thinking it through, but we haven't had the conversation really at a large public scale with people as to why this has to occur in their self-interest. And let me just pass on one little piece of information that you may all want to challenge, but after 40 years of doing this, I came to the conclusion that most people in cities make decisions based on schools, especially if they have children, on crime in the neighborhood or in the city, and on property values. And if you can't link what you're doing to those three things, to the betterment of people, it's a very tough fight. So Don, I don't know if I answered your question, but.
Yeah, very good. I appreciate that. Let me piggyback off one of the last things you said there. I've been suggesting for years that one of the biggest obstacles we face is that most cities never have a discussion about the future. They may say they're doing a general plan update, and I've seen dozens of them, and rarely do they begin by having a conversation how the world is going to change within the time horizon of their plan. They adopt a plan that says this is going to be for our town 2030 or our town 2060, whatever. But rarely do they spend more than a couple minutes at maybe one of the first meetings discussing how is the world going to change in that time? How do we need, if we want our community to continue to thrive economically, socially, and environmentally over the next 30 years, what changes do we need to be preparing for, reacting to, adapting to? That, other than climate change, which is, it's important, but I'm not certain that it necessarily leads to changes in land use policies in most cities. I've always felt that the most, if I were looking for a neutral way in, a neutral way to get past the barriers that Rick has identified very articulately, I would start by having something totally unrelated to the general plan. First of all, as soon as you have a general plan thing going, everyone's got their bristles up. They're concerned that how is it going to impact them. They no longer are neutral. They're looking at it from their own individual perspectives. If you want them to be more neutral, you need to start off with a conversation that's somewhat unrelated to the general plan. It may precede the general plan, but it should not be, it may be the best place to do it is maybe not within the general plan. I've often thought, for example, what if you start off, if you're going to do a general plan, a year from now, general plan update a year from now, let's start off and ask maybe like the League of Women Voters or a couple of organizations together to neutrally sponsor a discussion about how is the world likely to change in the coming decade, and how do we need to adapt our community to that, with a particular focus on the aging of our population. Because it's something that everyone's going to experience in their own lives one way or another. It's something everyone can understand. It's not something where they have to understand parts per million this or this tenth of a degree warmer or colder. It's something that that everyone can talk about and ask them to start off 2 or 3 simple questions and have this discussion. There's a number of ways you could do it. I won't get into the details, but the basic conversation is, how do we prepare our community so we have an age-friendly city going forward? Because it starts by just letting people know that the projections are we're going to be a heck of a lot more older in this city, and that's going to affect everything from our economy to the services we receive, the taxes, etc. Get people engaged in a discussion that they can participate in that isn't related to this project or that project or to a general plan update, which again, people are just immediately sort of in their defensive postures or aggressive postures whenever that comes around. Have a neutral discussion about the future. And a couple of years ago, I've spoken a number of times at San Jose State urban planning classes. And based on my experience out in the real world, one of the things I suggested to the professor there was that before they give any planner coming out of planning school their diploma, they should ask them to write a 1-page essay about how the world is likely to change during their lifetime, because I'm not certain that they've necessarily thought about that. Now I may be shortchanging some of the things, but I think I don't see a lot of futurism based on the day-to-day planning, because most planners don't do that sort of thing. We're involved in dealing with the nuts and bolts and the realities, the important realities of individual projects. But we have not yet figured out how to, or even become motivated to create a neutral dialogue about the future in our communities. And without that, I think Rick is right. Unless you give people a reason to come to their own conclusion that the city needs to change in some fashion, it's less likely to happen. It's probably unlikely to happen.
Thank you. I see Bob Levy has had his hand raised for 10 minutes. Are you, Bob, you want to?
He's just flipping me off. No.
I'll raise my hand.
Oh.
You spoke about solutions in common, and you've tended to take aging as one that could be looked at across a number of perspectives. How about air quality? And the only reason I'm saying that is because there are, we have all the mechanisms in place, like the Bay Area Air Quality Management District, the California Air Quality Board, the Supreme Court's decision in Massachusetts. It's all there right now. And when we use fossil fuels, we end up with dirty air. So it addresses the big issues as well as the little ones, such as minorities living along 101 and having to breathe the bad air, and then being victims of traffic and things like that. So what do you think about something like that?
Well, I guess I saw a discouraging headline the other day, because it didn't rise to that, but when they've been asking people to rate the issues that they care about right now, sort of politically, I think these are sort of national surveys. Unfortunately, the environment was like 23% of the people had it as a top priority, which is way below the economy, obviously, and the virus and so on. part of the challenge we have is that, well, we care, quite a great deal about the environment. It hasn't necessarily risen in political relevance to enough people that no matter what argument you make, that they're going to get it. Plus, it also sort of veers off into the area where you're talking about parts per billion, this and that, which glazes over most people's eyes. I wonder how many people, if you ask them, to degrade the air quality in the Bay Area. I mean, when I came here, I remember I drove down for my job interview on a early day in July, hot day, coming down Page Mill Road from Skyline, could not see the valley at all. It was just totally smogged in. I've not seen a day like that in decades. So I'm not certain that, maybe not everyone has that same perspective, but except when there's been wildfires, I don't know that air quality is a high priority issue for people. Maybe I'm not arguing that it shouldn't be, but part of it, sort of what Rick was saying, how do we find issues that actually provide leverage points into the lives of people, into the minds of people, into the values and concerns? I'm not even certain how many people, has anyone seen any surveys recently as to how people feel about even something as obvious as climate change? How many think it's their top priority for how they're going to vote, or, and what would they be willing to do in their own community? Would they be willing to have more housing built in order to reduce vehicle miles traveled? I don't know. I agree with your idea of trying to find new leverage points. I'm just still a little skeptical. I've not seen evidence that either climate change, much less air quality, which I think is maybe even a smaller sliver in terms of people's priorities. Doesn't mean we shouldn't keep working on it and keep pushing at it, but there are lots of good books out there now, and articles have been written about why do some people just continue to deny climate change, for example. And we can give them, libraries full of statistics, and it's not going to change their opinions. There's some others that have suggested we've got to get them to recognize that somehow it fits within their value system. And unfortunately, some of these issues, I'm not certain that air quality is any less polarized than climate change. Don't know, that's kind of a rambling answer, sorry, but.
I have a question and a comment, and it's probably way below your level of expectation, but.
All the better.
Well,
Thank you. I'm looking for that kind.
no, I really like your presentation. I mean, you covered a lot, and everything. There is so much to be addressed, and you're asking for a lot of conversations and a lot of support, and how to get that. But what I don't understand is I'm one of the elderly ones that have paid for my condo, and I don't have any other job, and I don't have a lot of money, and so it is a concern. And the other people that have moved because they got fed up of the situation and they had the money, they went elsewhere, so forth. There's all sorts, and I see the smog when I drive by because I have allergies also, so I'm very sensitive to smog, and I can see it. When you're looking as you're driving and you can't see the hills nice and clear, there's smog. And so I'm old, I see the smog. I can understand how the people that we need to help us, whether it's daycare or elderly, can't afford to live in the Bay Area. Even our kids, as they're growing up, kids, grandkids, and great-grandkids, they can't afford to live here. So of course they're gonna move out. So all these situations, you're right. But the way I see it, it's who makes the decision, if not, like you said, the planning, the city, the state, and us other people have to accommodate. We either move out or we go ahead and live and drive and work according to what is established or is being established. So to me, it's like, why all the frickin' discussions and all the need to discuss and get buy-in and all this? It's like, you guys, and I don't know how many of you, but I know you were either working or are working on the Santa Clara committee, right? Okay, why the hell are you not saying, okay, this is what's going to be? Period. It's like, I don't get it.
Okay.
I just don't get
it. My simplest answer to all of that is that ultimately there's no one in charge anywhere. By design, in several respects. First of all, we have decided that.
How do you establish that? How do you establish that? You know.
Well, it's a democracy. First of all, that we don't have a king. We may have a president who thinks he can make decrees, royal decrees, but without getting too political tonight. But
okay.
The bottom line is, when you look at land use planning, for example, we have 100 cities in the Bay Area. Each one of, and let's deal with Santa Clara County alone. We have 15 cities and the county. The county you would think is a higher jurisdiction than the cities, but the county has no control whatsoever in terms of land use over the city.
Yeah, we've seen that with the pandemic.
Yeah, well, that's a whole separate thing. But in terms of land use, and linking back to what Rick said, the planning commission people who get to are, the ones that planning staff, we make very few decisions. Minor decisions sometimes are made at a staff level, but the major ones occur at a higher level with the planning commission typically, or the board of supervisors or city council. And that's where politics comes into play. And that's where who gets elected to the city council determines who gets appointed to the planning commission in many cases. I don't mean to be discouraging about that, but the bottom line is we're dealing in a very decentralized democracy where no one has the power to decree anything. Now we're sort of testing the edges of that with the state legislation that's beginning to tell the cities that we're going to take some of that authority away from you. So to some extent, they aren't necessarily doing it wisely in all cases, that it's hard to write a law at the state level that isn't going to have, as Rick was pointing out, some unintended consequences that you thought it was going to apply to high density corridors, and in fact it's affecting low density suburban neighborhoods or whatever.
Is there a way to do more inspiring and less convincing, and to try to remove all the finger pointing? Is there some way of doing that? I mean, I like your presentation, but then when we start talking, it's more of kind of pointing to all what's not working, and then you get lost in all of that.
Yeah, well, I think ultimately, there's a phrase that Nancy Pelosi likes to say from Lincoln, that without public opinion you can't do anything, and with public opinion there's nothing you can't do.
But the public is not getting all your communications. I saw this and I thought, I'm curious to see what is being said. But it's not like before we had TV. So every other commercial, you could push your point and do a lot of publicity of this is the way to go, and people start buying into the idea because they see it over and over and over again. There's a lot less of that that is able to happen because people are doing either Netflix or the other things, or there's a lot more Zoom groups, so people are interested in that, and there's a lot more talking now this way. But I think maybe that's a way to look into, is to how do you publicize constantly those ideas so people get more information without having a lot of extra talk, extra elaboration, extra, so that people see,
Well, And good question. And then again, no simple answers. With democracy, we've got 2 million people living in Santa Clara County alone. So just even having a countywide dialogue is obviously a very challenging thing to do.
Yeah, so every time,
If there were some consensus.
every time when I talk, like I've talked to my park, I have a park across the street, and I've talked to the workers. I've elevated it to the city and the Department for Park and Recreation. I even wrote to the state one time. But it's like, yeah, they can see, but they're all so bogged down with the responsibility of having to do what the people above and the people below say, and that there's no leadership, that it goes back to more I can't versus being inspired that you can. It's like, how do you...
At the local level, most local officials plan, the planning staff, the one thing I used to tell my staff is, as planners, we have very little power, but we have our most effective tools are the power to influence at best.
Yeah, but that's what you get bogged down with.
That's the system we have. I can't, aside from declaring myself emperor of the Santa Clara County, and then having you starting a revolution against me, then
I think we're drifting away from city planning into.
Let me jump back in and try and piggyback off of what you're saying. There are different ways to have a community dialogue. It could begin at city government level. There are ways to do it within government. There are ways to do it in the community. It's hard to do it as individuals, but if, for example, all of the different organizations that have a stake, goes back to solutions in common, which is based on the premise that we have many different organizations that have different goals, but there are certain actions that could help them each accomplish their goals simultaneously. So, for example, if the local Sierra Club chapter had put out a position paper or something, or was articles in its newsletter saying that creating great urban neighborhoods is important for the sustainability of our community. If the affordable housing groups were using that same message, that in terms of meeting
right, and then point out the win-win.
Exactly.
It's going to bring you this, it's going to bring you that, and this will bring you this. And so if that's pitched so that it inspires.
I've just deputized you to start that conversation, by the way.
And well, I'm not for hire, but I have always been more of a cheerleader type. I've always been more of a cheerleader type. I like to cheer people on, and I think you have a great presentation. It's how to, pitch it so that it inspires and invites and creates synergy that way.
Got it.
Okay.
With Gary's help, why don't you use the Sierra Club as your guinea pig for that project? see if you can build a consensus just within the Sierra Club, the local Loma Prieta chapter, in support of urbanism versus, as a way of accommodating our future growth. And see what I'm sure there, like any organization, you're going to have diversity.
I'm not.
Okay, it's getting kind of late. We've taken 2 hours of Don's time, and
oh my God,
he spent most of the day preparing for this. So let me open it up for one new question, and we'll have an answer. Then we can close the evening. So I have one more question from somebody.
So what would you recommend for citizens to do? Is it just lobbying the local city council? Like what should we do if we want these great urban neighborhoods?
I think before you go to the city council, you have to begin to build community support for the idea. Because as Rick says, they ultimately they get voted in, they get voted out, depending on where they stand on the growth or no growth sort of issue, or whether that particular housing projects that they approved got them on the wrong side of certain groups in the community. So I think the last one you go to is the city council is sort of followers rather than leaders in many cases. I mean, they're to some degree expected to be representative of their community and the voices in their community. Somehow we've got to have a community dialogue about the future. I mean, I know that sounds very ethereal and when when Gary introduced me, he said, Don has both practical experience, and then he sort of hesitated, trying to think out what else you were going to say. I was thinking, I said, put down impractical experience as well. But that would be the other
I
side.
said academic.
And I don't have an easy answer, but I can't think of a better, in a democracy, you could start protesting. I mean, if you look at, you can either educate people quietly or, calmly, or you can protest, or you can, combination. No simple playbook for this, but you can start by asking, what role is my own organization? Many of you are, I assume because you're here, are active in one way or another with the Sierra Club. If you were going to take seriously, the words of the national organization, that they are in favor of environmental and social justice, how can you implement that at the local level? Maybe it's by creating more affordable housing, which may have to be more higher density, but shouldn't be just an isolated project, should be part of a neighbor. Maybe that's the way in. You got to use whatever megaphones you've got. And the thing that, where I'm most disappointed is I think the planning profession overall, and I'm not trying to condemn everyone individually, but I have not seen any really intelligent discussions about the future that have preceded general plan updates. They usually jump right into making decisions about one thing or another, or one chapter of the plan or another, without having said, what's the world we like 20 years from now? How is that different from today? And how should our plan reflect that? So for example, if we know that one thing is a given pretty much, we're gonna have a much older population. Okay, well then how will that affect the housing element of our plan? How will that affect the transportation element? How will that affect the parks and recreation element? You've got a basis for making some decisions. You have to have a touch point. But we haven't had that broader discussion about how the world is changing, other than the climate change one. And I think that's in some ways too, it's important, but it's to most people, it's sort of abstract as to, and it makes them feel powerless that, what do I have to do if we have to get the planet to reduce its carbon emissions and I'm only emitting this, there's a lot that can be done by individual behavior, but I think a lot of people don't necessarily see that that's going to get them there. We've got to focus on issues that they can relate to. And I think the aging one is the one to me is the most promising one, because everyone can play the game, everyone experiences it one way or another. But that's,
right.
That's my impractical idea for you.
All right. Thank you very much, Don, for an outstanding presentation and a highly engaging dialogue with many of the people who stuck around.
Thank you, Don.
Just briefly, next month, second Wednesday, we plan to have a discussion about drawdown. He mentioned climate change, which is a title of a book having to do with things we could do to actually absorb the carbon dioxide, excessive carbon dioxide that's in the atmosphere. So it'll be a combination of some discussions and some videos. So thank you all for coming. I'll bid you all a good night and look forward to seeing you again.
Yeah. Thanks, Gary.
Thanks,
Thank
Gary.
you, everyone.
Sure.
Bye,
You're
everyone.
welcome. Thank
Stay
you
well.
very much.
Very,
Bye-bye. Good seeing you all again.
Yep.
And
See you,
for the
Don.
first time. Hey, Molly, nice to see you again.
Nice to see you.
Bye-bye.
All right. So good night, all.